It's my pleasure to be here with you all. Welcome to the PEC Authors Fest. And wow, it's an amazing lineup again. We're really happy for the next hour. We're going to talk about this book. This is The Woman Before Wallace by Bryn Turnbull. Bryn will be joining us in a moment. Really enjoyed reading this lovely, lovely book and lots to talk about in it. But let's learn a little bit about Bryn before she comes up on screen. Bryn Turnbull, writer of historical fiction, and says with a penchant for fountain pens and antique furniture. She's equipped with a Master of Letters in Creative Writing from the University of St. Andrews, a Master of Professional Communication from Ryerson University, and a bachelor's degree in English Literature from McGill University. Bryn focuses on finding the stories of women found within the cracks of the historical record. She lives in Toronto, and The Woman Before Wallace is her first novel. And this is the story of Thelma Morgan. We're going to learn quite a bit more about Thelma over the next hour. So please welcome Bryn Turnbull.
Hi.
Hello, how are you today?
Oh, I'm good. How are you?
No, doing just fine, doing fine. You can see I have all of Prince Edward County behind me here, and I believe you have the entire city of Toronto in the backdrop for you. And welcome to the Authors Festival. It's great to have you here, and congratulations on this book. How does it feel to get that first novel out?
Oh my gosh, it feels amazing. You start writing a book and you really don't think anyone's ever going to read it, right? Like this was kind of a passion project for me. And when I started writing it, it really kind of just grew and grew and grew. And I started spending more and more time on it. And I realized, this was a story that I was really lucky to be able to tell it.
Yeah. I suppose we'll spend some time talking about it, but I was intrigued. Just one little thing before you go into your reading. Thank you for agreeing to read from the book today. The movie produced by Madonna that gave you the entry point to the whole story.
Yeah.
It's wonderful.
I know. Yeah, I've got Madonna to thank for it.
Can you tell us a story about that? Like something, so you're watching a film and something just jumped out at you.
Yeah. So Madonna in 2011, she directed a movie called W.E. and it's about Wallace and Edward and the start of their relationship. And she referenced this moment between Thelma and Wallace Simpson. Thelma at the time was involved with the Prince of Wales and she needs to leave him for a period. So she says to Wallace, take care of him while I'm gone. And I remember watching this movie. It was, like the scene in the movie where these two actresses are lying on a bed and they have this conversation. And I thought to myself, what an odd question to ask. Even if somebody that you implicitly trust, it's still a strange question. And where did that come from? And that really was the genesis of my interest in Thelma. And, I fell down a Wikipedia rabbit hole and I thought it was going to be the story of a woman who didn't want to be with the Prince of Wales anymore, knowing how, needy he was as an individual. I thought it was a story of a woman saying to her friend, look, I am leaving the barn door open. And if the horse gets out, the horse gets out. And ultimately, that wasn't the story that I ended up writing. But yeah, Madonna has, I have to thank her for giving me that entry point.
There's little moments in history, right? To your point about lost in the cracks of history. Well, fantastic. Well, I'm going to turn this over to you and your reading. And if you want to tell us a bit about the passage you're going to share with us and read away.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me to the Authors Festival. It's a real pleasure to be here. So the scene that I'm going to read from this book, I mentioned that Thelma had to leave Edward for a period of time and she asked Wallace to take care of him while she was traveling. And the reason she left was to support her twin sister, Gloria Vanderbilt, during a custody trial, a really sort of down and dirty rock'em sock'em custody battle over her daughter, little Gloria Vanderbilt. So the scene I've chosen to write, it comes quite early on in the book. It is when Thelma is traveling across the Atlantic to go support her sister. And it's just a little bit of sort of the backstory to what's going on there. So October 9th, 1934, RMS Empress of Britain. The wood-paneled tea room had begun to fill with passengers seeking refuge from the chill wind that blew off the sea, but Thelma was already stationed at a small table beneath a lacquered oriental painting of willow trees. She studied the painting, admiring the play of bright brown and gold in the leaves. Did it look different in the morning light? But was interrupted by the thud of a newspaper hitting the table. "I've been looking for you all over this damn boat," said Harry. He took a seat opposite Thelma's and called for a waiter. "Did you see yesterday's headline?" Every newspaper in Europe, it seemed, was following the trial, basking in Gloria's misfortune. Vanderbilt widow, penniless, without heiress, taught. Fight to the bitter end for the Vanderbilt girl. There would be more articles waiting when they landed. Thelma was sure of it, given the scene she'd made when she'd boarded the Empress in Southampton. She'd been mobbed by reporters at the dockyard, a swarm of them shouting questions one over the other as she and Harry walked up the gangplank. "Lady Furness," shouted one reporter, his voice cutting through the shipyard commotion. "Do you know your own mother will be testifying against Mrs. Vanderbilt?" "I do," said Thelma, "and she's mad to do so, absolutely mad." The reporters scribbled, and one young man raised his pen. "What do you say to the maid's allegations about Nada Mountbatten? Will her ladyship come to Mrs. Vanderbilt's defense?" Thelma gripped the railing to still her shaking hand. "All I have to say," she said, "is that my mother is mad to indulge this fantasy. Absolutely mad." Thelma shook her head, thankful she'd been able to escape into the sanctuary of the ship. "Nada won't come," said Harry, his fingers trembling as he folded the newspaper. "She's sending a lawyer, wants to keep away from all this." He let out an involuntary noise and closed his eyes, waiting for the tremor to pass. "Friedel is, though. He's told reporters he's leaving on the Bremen." "Good." Prince Friedel Hohenlohe, Gloria's former fiancé, had been heartbroken when Gloria rejected his proposal. But what choice did she have when Mama accused him of wanting to do little Gloria harm? Thelma could have laughed at the accusations if they weren't such a threat. According to Mama, Gloria had neglected her daughter to the point of cruelty, a claim that Gertrude Whitney, Reggie's sister, had accepted far too easily, far too quickly. Yes, Gloria entertained friends on a regular basis, but never at her daughter's expense. Yes, Gloria traveled frequently, but she made sure that little Gloria never wanted for nothing, regardless of whether they were in Paris or Biarritz, New York or London. Hadn't that been the point of Mama joining their household in the first place? And where had Gloria learned about motherly love? All through their childhood, Thelma and her siblings had been dragged from country to country according to their mother's changeable whims. Consuelo had been stashed away with a family friend in the United States from the time she was 13, and Thelma and Gloria had barely seen Harry as children, closeted away in a Swiss boarding school. Harry sipped his coffee, looking at Thelma over his shaking cup. "I wanted to talk to you about what you said to the reporters this morning." "What about?" said Thelma. "I'm right, aren't I? Mama's mad, and that's all there is to it. The public ought to know." Harry sighed. "Maybe so, but discrediting her on the front page won't help Gloria's case." Thelma's irritation, with Harry, with Gloria, with Mama, spilled over. "I'm trying to discredit her," she said. "She's mad as a cat. The media ought to know what sort of person is behind all the ridiculous accusations Gertrude's accepting as fact." "And it will," said Harry, "but it's for the lawyers to bring it all out in court. They have a strategy, and we won't help by creating another arena for combat." Thelma exhaled, biting back her next retort. Hadn't Mama's side already claimed that battlefield? "It just makes me so cross, Harry." "I know." Harry signaled for the waiter, who came with a billfold. "Promise me you'll speak to Gloria's lawyers before you make any more statements to the press." Harry signed the bill and stood. Thelma finished the last dregs of her tea and followed him through the first-class corridor in silence. When they reached Thelma's cabin, Harry cleared his throat. "I need your word that you won't make any more unauthorized statements, Thelma," he said. "You can't do that to Gloria." Again, Thelma refrained from snapping. Lawyers wouldn't help Gloria's reputation, not when the judge had closed the courtroom to reporters for the rest of the trial. How could Harry not see that? Gloria had to be vindicated by her friends, her family, those able to defend her outside the courtroom, as well as those fighting within it. "It's ghoulish," she said. "I won't let Mama spread such lies." "I can't stop you from speaking your mind, Thelma, but please consider your actions," Harry replied. "Calling Mama names in the papers. Can't you see how that looks?" She pictured two fishmongers' wives brawling in the streets. "You're right," she said. "Of course." Harry nodded, the twitch in his cheek more pronounced than earlier. "You're a good sister," he said with a sudden smile. "You and Gloria, always two of a kind, aren't you? The magnificent Morgans." He sobered, stepping away as Thelma crossed into her berth. "You can't fight this battle for her. Remember that when we get to New York, as difficult as it may be." Thelma shut the door to her stateroom. The magnificent Morgans, she thought, recalling a newspaper article from their days as New York socialites. They had always been magnificent, her and Gloria. The world knew it, which was perhaps why it was so taken with Gloria's trial. She turned Harry's words over in her mind. "You can't fight this battle for her." came from a good place, really, but Harry didn't understand. Thelma would always fight Gloria's battles, just as Gloria had always fought hers. Here we go.
There we go. I'm unmuted now. Okay. Thank you for the reading. Thank you. This is where normally when we were in the library, everyone would be clapping, and we enjoy that. And we enjoy our, we've already see we've got some comments coming up in the chat bar. So we're going to get to those and any questions that come up there. But let's just talk about the grand sweep of this right now. I'm just going to list off some names here, most of which appeared in that passage. Mountbatten, Vanderbilt, House of Windsor, Morgan, and Whitney. Yes, so transatlantic empires of tremendous power, and a story that can appear at first glance like a footnote in a major power struggle. Yet in many ways is almost a keystone to the whole to several struggles and links all these things together. A custody battle in the United States and a later abdication of the throne in 1936-37. So you mentioned, we got into talking about your first discovery of this, and you had to dig in. At what point did you realize how epic this story really is in terms of how many things it touched on? Like there's some point in that wiki wander down the rabbit hole, as you said, where you probably looked around at files and notes and said, oh my God, what do I have here?
Yeah, absolutely. I thought, as I said, when I started writing the book, I thought it was going to be a story about Thelma and Edward. I thought it was going to be the love story of Thelma and Edward. And when I started diving into Thelma's life, really, Edward wasn't the important part of her life. Edward wasn't the love of her life. The love of her life was her sister, Gloria. And that, to me, became the genesis of this book. It became the point of interest. But, Thelma, like so many women in the historical record, got kind of swept away by the events that followed her. She wasn't seen as important. She wasn't seen as the reason that Edward and Wallace met, which she was. She was a person who introduced Edward and Wallace. And she also wasn't seen for this role that she played in what was at the time the biggest custody battle in US history. I think it might actually still be the biggest custody battle in US history. And so when I realized that Thelma was central not only to one major event of the 1930s being the abdication crisis, but this other one, this custody battle, it astounded me that nobody had written her story on its own merits before. People had written about the custody battle, they'd written about the abdication, but in both of those, Thelma was always a footnote, and that just didn't sit right with me. She was the woman who links these two, she links American and British royalty, if you want to call it that.
Yeah, I'm sort of picturing this moment where you see the depths of these facts and just say, okay, am I taking crazy pills? Is nobody else seeing this?
Well, I mean, and it's one of those perfect examples of truth being stranger than fiction, right? I did not make up I didn't make up this story. This actually happened to this woman. And it was just like, oh, I couldn't have made it up. If I was just writing it fictionally, I couldn't have made it up better.
Now, let's talk about that here too, because you do have, in writing historical fiction, you're in that strange dance that all writers of historical fiction have, is that in amassing as many facts as you can and trying to learn these characters and their personalities and then imagining them in their private spaces. How did you approach that? Did you set yourself some rules, or how did you work at it?
Yeah, for me, the important thing was treating these characters with respect. They're historical figures, they've got living descendants. And to me, the most important thing was, am I doing everything I can to get to the truth of this person? Am I vilifying them? Am I stereotyping who they were? And so that really was the spirit in which I approached all of these characters. And the nice thing is, with all of these characters, they all left memoirs. Thelma and Gloria wrote a joint autobiography. Edward and Wallace, of course, there's so much information on them. And And because of that, I was able to really get a sense of their voices, and I was able to in a lot of cases, let them speak for themselves, which really helped me in kind of pulling out those moments of their life that did have to be fictionalized, those closed door conversations and the motivations that kind of propelled them through from point A to point B.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, I could see that there, the issue just might almost be the wealth of information available, like how to not drown in it.
Oh
You know?
gosh, yeah. Well, and the big thing is figuring out the truth between subjective experiences, right? Because you can have the same moment given to you by Wallace in her autobiography, say, and then given by Thelma in hers. And so which one of those, knowing that both of those women are writing for posterity, where's the truth of the matter, and how do you kind of tease that out?
Yeah. Let's just go. We've got a couple questions in the chat bar here, so I'm going to read one of them to you right
Yeah,
now. So this one's coming from Lena. Lena says, "Love the book, Bryn. A
thank you.
question about Thelma's reaction to the marriage of David and Wallace. In your research, did you come across Thelma's reaction to the marriage, and were there any further interactions between? Sorry, I keep calling her Thelma Wallace and David. Thelma Wallace and David.
Yeah, so Thelma was very much blindsided. As I said, when I started writing this story, when I started looking into who Thelma was, I thought that it was going to be a story of a woman who was sick of Edward, because I knew, I knew the story of Edward and Wallace. I knew that he was a very weak man, a very needy individual, and he would have been, quite frankly, exhausting as a romantic partner, and not in a good way. But I think that when it came to Thelma coming back across the Atlantic, we have this moment in the history books where Thelma comes back. She thinks that she and Edward are fine, and she goes to a dinner party, and Wallace slaps Edward's hand at the table quite playfully when he reaches for a piece of salad with his fingers. And she had no idea that in the time that she was away, in those 6 weeks that she was away, that Edward and Wallace had grown so close. So they're really, she truly was blindsided by it. And after that dinner, things devolved very quickly. Edward basically kind of he kind of pushed Thelma aside and didn't really speak to her again. And Wallace was quite central in that. Wallace did not allow Edward to have relationships with any of his ex-partners. Frida Dudley Ward, for example, with whom Thelma got along and who had been an incredibly important friend in Edward's life, not just romantically, but platonically a friend. Wallace didn't want that relationship there. So Wallace really did isolate him after she became involved with him. And so, no, they didn't have any point of contact after that one fateful dinner.
That's quite the dinner party. Yeah. We got another question. This one's from Janet. We'll just contextualize this a bit. Do you know whether Anderson Cooper has read or is aware of your book? So Anderson Cooper, son of little Gloria Vanderbilt, so descendant of Gloria, and I guess Thelma would be his great aunt.
Yeah, Thelma's his great aunt.
Yeah.
So Anderson Cooper, I did send him a note when the book came out saying, basically, thank you for having this incredible ancestor, and please, I hope that you don't hate it. But no, I haven't had any contact with him past that. So I don't know. He might know of it. He may have gotten that email, but unfortunately with COVID, it became very difficult to be able to send him a physical copy or, be able to get in touch with him that way. So that's what it is. But again, I hope that he, first of all, knowing how open he is about his family's about his family history was a great thing. He and his mother wrote that, they wrote a memoir together. His mother has written multiple memoirs. So I hope that he would take it in the spirit in which it's offered.
Well, and there is a family link in a sense that his story is a sibling story as well, and a tragic one.
Very much so.
Yeah, it was his twin brother, I believe. The story, was it a brother or a twin? I'm not sure if it is a twin or not.
I don't know that he was a twin brother, but it was his brother. Yes.
Yes, and a long battle with mental illness and was lost to suicide. Both Gloria Vanderbilt and Anderson Cooper are very open about that. And it was interesting reading about these two sisters knowing that context of the descendants. Like, and I have to admit here, I'll be fully honest. I'm the farthest thing from a royalist. It's kind of deadly to say out here, but yet, somebody got me to watch episode 1 of The Crown, and I was hooked because
Well,
these became real stories, and like real people. And this book does the same thing, where you see people struggling with things that are part of the context of their lives, and part of them are just real and other things that are real everyday struggles that everyone has in terms of their own identity and how they're going to get by. There's something I was thinking about here too, in terms of just stepping back from the call it the story itself, and just talking about the characters in it. And there's something really interesting about the characters here, in that you have many self-destructive characters on the page available to you. There's a
mhm.
lot of people who are doing things that aren't necessarily in their own interest, and you watch through your fingers sometimes, going, "Oh no, no, don't do that." And yet, everyone is working to a certain sense about self-preservation, preserving their place in society, preserving their wealth, preserving their I guess their day-to-day routine, that kind of thing. There's this whole thing about order and chaos going on here. Um, and one thing I think about that is that that kind of character is gold on the page. Like, I mean, I'll say this to students all the time, and they have I don't know if I should write about this character. They just do things that I don't like. I'm going, no, you really, please write about them.
Interesting characters. Like
Yes.
nobody's going to root for a perfect person. There's no ambiguity. There's no depth to somebody who is so completely morally always going to make the right decision. It's those characters who turn down the wrong paths that are interesting, because they're the ones that we say, well, what would I do in that situation, right? Because I'm not perfect, and I don't claim, I don't pretend to be perfect. So I think that, yeah, I think it's the flawed ones where that really shine.
Yeah, the well-lived life just doesn't work out on the page. Um, it's one of those things. I just noticed we got another question from Lena here. Um, this is again just about um, the sisters. Without any obvious sources of income and a string of failed ventures behind them, how did Gloria and Telma support themselves in later life?
In later life, they supported themselves. So it was actually quite interesting, because when Telma married Duke, her husband Marmaduke Furness, he was the wealthiest man in Britain at the time. He was an industrialist, shipping magnate. And when they got married, Duke asked her to sign, essentially, it was a document. It wasn't a prenup, but it was a document to say, if we ever were to divorce, if we were ever to split up, I would provide you with a source of income. And Telma was incensed. She did not want to sign it. She felt that would be, kind of cursing their marriage from the outset. And she put up quite a fight not to sign it. Ultimately, she did. And that was what sustained them later in life, was this annuity from Duke.
Neat. Okay. By the way, just for those joining us, we're here with author Bryn Turnbull, and we're talking about the book The Woman Before Wallace. This great first novel, historical novel that gets into so much stuff, and we got plenty more to talk about. So thank you for joining in. I was reading in the author's Q&A in the back of the book. It was in one of the, there's a few really good reader's guides, and I think a Q&A at the back of the book. And one of them, you've made a comment about, and I don't want to give away too much of the story here in terms of the natures of some of the scandals that your readers are going to read about here, because some of the people watching probably are about to read this book and haven't yet read it. But you made an interesting comment about how sexual liberation was a privilege of an elite and ruling class.
Yes.
In that time. So, if we want to talk about moral austerity, that's something imposed on those who don't have power and don't have money and aren't part of society.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
um, and it's specifically in the context of talking about Gloria Vanderbilt. Um, was that something that sort of became like, was writing this story kind of a moment of becoming aware of that, or is that something that you sort of were seeing in the, like where did you come to that observation? I mean, I think it's an astute observation, and I agree with it. But how did you come to it? Like, what was it through writing this, or?
Well, I mean, I think that that's still the case in a lot of places. I think that I think that people who are living at the top are able to get away with a lot more. I think that sins don't stick to the wealthy as they do to people who don't have that cushion to hide behind, that ability to, that ability to retreat and be able to support themselves. So I mean, it was a really interesting story to me, and certainly in Thelma and Gloria's case, you see it so clearly. And add on top of that the way that women really, like the choices for women in the 1930s were so limited. And really for a lot of women, the book starts out, this isn't a spoiler, but the book starts out with Thelma's mother instilling in them from childhood that they are to marry money because that will allow them a level of flexibility, that'll allow them independence. And for women in the 1930s, that was really what they were told. It was, you have to marry in order to be financially secure. And Thelma is such an interesting case because, and the 1930s in general are an interesting case because that's the first moment where women are really not as bound by those, by that economic system, right? Women are, you've got female fashion designers who are all of a sudden exploding in France. You've got, female actors, female musicians. You've got all of these women who are all of a sudden no longer tied financially to a husband and tied financially to that system. So I think that, it was interesting to me to see this woman who grew up with that in her head and realizing maybe that that's not necessarily the case, but she's still too early to do anything about it. Whereas a character like her stepdaughter, Avril, who is independently wealthy, can make choices that are, really choices that she's able to make for herself.
Yeah, no, in Thelma, you really have someone who is going to do her own thing to a certain extent. Like she gets advice at various times. In fact, the passage you read to start our talk today, where she's talking to Harry, it's very clear where she's going. She'll listen to advice, and then she's going to make her own choices on that. And an interesting thing about that mother um, talking to Gloria and Thelma and telling them to go towards money, and that's the same mother whose mama, who is about, as you alluded to in that, who's about to testify against Gloria in court. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
there's many things going on there. By the way, for those watching, if you have any questions for Bryn Turnbull, either about her work or her research, or especially about this book, The Woman Before Wallace, please fire them up in the chat bar. We're happy to take your questions and talk about them. I've got one here too. You have a double timeline story going on here. So this is where we're going to geek out a bit on the technical side of it, because it always gets tricky. You essentially have a story that begins. Okay, we have the two stories. One begins essentially with the leaving to go from London to New York in 1934. So it's a brief timeline, all set in 1934. A trip home and the events in court immediately after at the end of that trip home, and that cuts back and forth between a longer timeline that I think begins mid 1920s, 26
Yep.
or so, and then goes to about 33.
Yep.
So there's a lot to keep track of there. So as you were writing this out, I mean, I know let's get past the drafting stages or the, oh my gosh, what have I gotten into stages and how much more research do I have to do stages. But when you're finally trying to get a coherent draft of this story, something you can work with down, was there any strategy or rules you set for yourself for how to do that, how to keep track of these two stories, or how they would work?
Yeah, so initially when I started writing the book, it was a linear storyline. And I remember I was at St. Andrews, where I did my master's in creative writing, talking to my mentor about it. And he said, well, if you're going to write it as a linear storyline, why don't you just write a nonfiction book? And I left that conversation, was like, no, he doesn't know what he's talking about. It's going to be a linear storyline. It's going to be great as that. And as I was walking home, I'm walking along the beach. I lived right on the beach in Scotland. It was wonderful. And so I'm walking home and I'm thinking to myself, well, really, what is the story that I'm trying to say? Am I telling a story about an individual woman and her experiences? Or am I trying to tell a story that's thematically bigger? Am I trying to tell a story that is more universal in its scope? And if I were to be doing that, what is it that I'm trying to say? What are the important themes that I want readers to walk away with? And what are those important moments in Thelma's life that can tease out those themes? And that was when I settled on the idea of Thelma caught between American and British royalty, as represented by her relationship with Edward and by this court trial. And that became a much more interesting and a much more tension-filled space to work within. So that was really where that structure came from, was looking at Thelma as caught in the middle of these two historic events. And from there, keeping it straight in my head, I had quite a number of literal graphs built out in my room, looking at all the events and trying to make sure that the timelines worked, and that, kind of going from there. So yeah, it was old school. It was a lot of old pieces of paper pinned up to a board.
Yeah, it has to get pretty analog in those moments. I know other writers who have clotheslines in their offices and have pages on them.
Oh, I like that. I should take that idea. That's a good one.
I tried it once. I hate it. I'm more like get everything out on the floor and then start walking on it. I think the most I've ever had is 71 pages out on the floor at a time, and I just about lost my mind then. But yeah, well, I mean, I asked the question because I think your transitions are quite seamless. Like, I think they work very well. And what happens is just the nature of I guess the 1926 to 33 storyline, there's more material there. It takes up more time on the page, but what its function does is as the story goes along, knowing what's happened in those years 1926 to 33 and getting to know all these characters and the various, as you say, American and British royalties that are in play here, each subsequent scene, whenever we cut back into the 1934 is further and further contextualized. It's known and understood better, and it's there for the reader. What happens is, you referred to it as tension, and I think that context and that knowledge that's building up in the reader's experience is making that happen there. That was my observation of what happened.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and I don't know, for me, what was important was setting up the dominoes, right? Like, I wanted to make sure that all of this 1926 to 1933 scenes set up all the dominoes so that finally at the end of the book in 1934, I could flick the dominoes and have them all.
Yeah. Get them all in line. Good. Well, we got some more viewer questions here. Just from Sharon, I wants to know, how long did it take you to write the book?
Yeah, just a little bit of time. I started writing the book, when was it? So it was about 5 years start to finish. 2 years were solid research. 2 years were solid writing. And then 1 year was sort of all the publishing side of it, getting it kind of prepped for going out and being on the shelves. But yeah, it was a lot of time. And quite frankly, I loved doing the research. Like, I could stay in the research phase. I could have stayed in the research phase for like another year quite happily, but yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, actually leads into our next question. This is from Janet. How important were diaries and letters in your research, and where did you find them?
Oh gosh, they were so important. A lot of them are really public domain, right? Like Edward and Wallace's letters, we have those. We've got, all the history books that kind of pull all those together. Thelma and Gloria wrote, as I mentioned, an autobiography, which was really, really important in getting their side of the story, getting her side of the story in particular. And then there was a book that was published in 1974, I think, called Little Gloria Happy at Last, and that chronicled the court trial. So Barbara Goldsmith, the author of that book, was able to get the court transcript unsealed. And I went to the New York Supreme Court. I tried to get the court transcript unsealed, but it didn't end up happening. So thank goodness I had this, this other author had gone before me and had done all the legwork on that. But yeah, I mean, they were really important. And the nice thing about this time period is also we're dealing with characters who are on screen as well. We've got Edward and Wallace in conversation. We've got Thelma and Gloria in conversation. And, you can find clips on YouTube of these people. And so that was really important in getting the cadence of their dialogue, Wallace in particular. Wallace has such a distinctive way of speaking. And it was, I really enjoyed the challenge of trying to get that down on the page.
Great, great. Well, you have the Duke and Duchess of York, future king and queen as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'd say not just cameos. They're definitely part of this story. Another question here. Did you travel to see some of the settings where this story played out? That's coming from Chris.
Yes, I did. So that was one of the reasons when I mentioned I went to school in Scotland, and one of the reasons I chose to go to the UK was because I would be able to kind of get a sense of of Thelma's world and visit places she'd been, Melton Mowbray, London, like all, her various houses in London, and getting a sense, literally walking from her apartment at Arlington Place to York House and realizing how close and how insular her world was. That was really interesting and really rewarding, because that kind of gives you a sense of stuff that you can't necessarily find online or in the history books, like even just how the light falls on cobblestones in that part of London, right? That sort of thing is such a wonderful, intangible experience, which I think for me really helped give me a sense of Thelma and the world that she inhabited.
Yeah. Yeah, and then taking those details and putting them in your story, just those little crystallizing details that make moments alive and real and
Mm-hmm.
lingering after after you put the book away. Yeah, wonderful. We have one more question I'm seeing here. A lot of interest here, so hopefully we'll get to everybody's questions. This is from Lena. What was the most interesting or unexpected piece of information you came across during the research phase?
The most unexpected was that Edward had a real affinity for toasters. Loved toasters. He was a very much he really enjoyed American culture because he saw it as very modern and very much farther ahead than the stodgy Brits were. And so he had this thing for toasters. He was so excited. Anytime he saw a toaster, it was like the greatest moment of the day. And people used to come to parties. People would come to, his country house parties, and they'd bring him toasters, and he'd be happy as a little clam. But one of the other bits, just kind of like building on that, and his, his drive to be modern. There is a museum in Gatineau, Quebec, Vintage Wings Museum, that has an airplane that belonged to Edward, a Fox-Moth biplane. It's got a little enclosed cabin for the passengers and an open cockpit for the pilot. And on the wing of the plane is a little generator. And, I was walked through the plane, and, I was able to kind of crawl in it. It was just the greatest day. And they're showing me this generator. And the reason that Edward had it installed was because he wanted to be a modern king. He felt it was very important to be modern, and he wanted to be able to listen to the wireless radio while the plane was in flight, so that he would never miss the news. Great, modern, interesting, impressive, right? So that plane I wasn't able to go up in that plane because they were redoing the control panels, but they took me up in a plane of a similar vintage. And I'm up in this plane. I've got the giant headphones on. I've got the helmet on, and it was so loud, so loud. I couldn't hear anything. I could not hear the pilot as he was speaking to me through the headphones. And so that became a really interesting moment for me in my characterization of Edward, because I came to, it was very clear that even with this wireless radio, you wouldn't hear anything in it. But for Edward, it didn't matter about whether he could hear anything or not. It mattered that he was seen as modern, right? It mattered that he had the impression, he gave off the impression of being a modern man. And that was more important than actually, being able to do anything with it.
There's something interesting there about the application of technology, like appetite for technology and application of technology. We could take some contemporary lessons from that, I'm sure. Just seeing another question here. Thank you, Bryn. By the way, for those joining us, we're talking with Bryn Turnbull. This is the Prince Edward County Authors Fest, and we're talking about her book, The Woman Before Wallace. I keep getting this, I don't get in front of the camera the right way. By the way, beautiful design on the cover.
Oh, I love the cover. I love it.
So let's go. Another question from Janet. Who is your next subject? Is there a book in the works?
There is, absolutely. I just handed in the edits for my second book. It's called The Last Grand Duchess, and it is about Olga Romanov, the eldest daughter of Nicholas and Alexandra.
Oh my.
Yep.
Where have your travels taken you in researching that one?
Well, that was a little more difficult because I was all set to go to Russia, all excited. I was planning the trip, and then the pandemic happened and the border shut. So I wasn't able to go, unfortunately. Thank goodness for the internet. Thank goodness for all of the wonderful people who went to Tsarskoye Selo and, did travel diaries and put them up on YouTube, because that's, unfortunately, that's the brave new world we're living in right now. So hopefully one day I'll get there.
Now, I'm always wary to dig too deep here, because sometimes we don't want to talk about the things that are in the works, but can you tell us a bit about what drew you to Olga?
Yeah, I can actually. So Olga, Nicholas and Alexandra, the last Romanovs, it's such a mythic story, right? And it's a very well-known story, but the daughters always, anytime you see them in the history books, anytime you see them in a documentary, they're a unit. It's Otma. That's what they were called. Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia. People referred to them as Otma, and they referred to them as this real unit. And with the exception of Anastasia, because of the Disney movie, we really don't know anything about the other sisters. And so what drew me to Olga as a main character was she nursed during the war and was a hands-on, she was a hands-on first Red Cross nurse during the war, which was interesting to me. And second of all, she was really the only one of the daughters who was politically astute and who understood what was going on. So in her diary, after Rasputin is murdered, she writes, "I understand why they did it." And so that for me was the genesis of my interest in her, is, okay, she has a political understanding. And that was kind of, that's the domino that fell down in that book.
Fantastic. Well, so we'll look for that. Is there a title for that book yet, or is it settled?
It's called The Last Grand Duchess.
Last Grand Duchess. Thank you. You did say that. I'm just trying to keep track. So we'll look for The Last Grand Duchess. Just looking, a question I have, I like to ask this of any time only because it's been thrown at me, and I valued the question, and so I'll answer this however you want. But The Woman Before Wallace, how did writing this book change you?
Oh, that is a good question. I mean, on a more superficial level, shall we say, this book changed my life dramatically because I was working full-time in a career that I couldn't stand beforehand. I wasn't happy with the direction my life was going in. And then Thelma came across, she kind of came across my world. And in writing the book, my world changed, right? I was able, I'm now a full-time author, which is incredible. And it's all I've ever wanted to do in my life. So I have Thelma to thank for that. I'd say that I've gained an understanding I've gained a deeper understanding of other people. I think that I've gained a sense of empathy through writing this person's story. And I mean, I understand that these are these are people that you wouldn't necessarily look at and empathize with, right? Because they're so, they're wealthy and they're untouchable, and and we're talking about literal princes, and it's easy to look at these characters and write them off for that reason. And so it was interesting to me to be able to look and see, flaws exist at all levels of society, and pain exists at all levels of society, and heartbreak, and all of these universal human experiences that I think it's easy to overlook. So that I think was a really interesting lesson for me to learn.
Well, I think you succeeded, because these are all real people on the page. They're they're written with the context of who they are and what powers they are, and also what the limitations of those powers or those privileges are, and also maybe what some of the traps of their privileges are.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's I think that is a well, the word compassion is used a lot, but I always think of compassion has some link to imagination. That's a well imagined person. And by imagined, I don't mean made up, but the idea of thinking and feeling through their experience, and that's certainly coming through here. So thank you for taking that question. Appreciate that. I want to tell you now about one of my favorite, just fun scenes in this, because we have time, I think. Unless if there's any more questions, if you're watching at home, feel free to just throw your questions up into the chat box. I've got it live on the side of my screen here, so I can keep an eye on those. But on page 235, 236, there's a scene where the Prince of Wales and Thelma and the Duke and Duchess of York, and I believe their brother George, climb up into a turret and start smashing records. And I was like, this is just so perfect. I'm assuming they would be 78 RPM records. I think they would have been in that era. I have to, I don't think 33 LPs were too common then. And there's a scene where they're claiming, yeah, they just say these are indestructible. So, well, let's find out. And it turns out it's the Queen Mother, the Duchess of York, the future Queen Mother, who proves to be incredibly adept at smashing records thrown off the turret of an old fort turned into a manor home. How fun was that to write? And was that based on any fact, or is that just something you imagined?
No, that actually did happen. That happened. And the interesting thing, Wallace actually, so there's a mini series that came out in the 70s about Wallace and Edward. And I think it's called The Prince and Mrs. Simpson or something like that. And they reference that scene of the record smashing. And that actually came from Thelma's memoirs. Thelma was the one who was there. It wasn't Wallace, but that moment has been taken and it's sort of been like written into Wallace's story, which didn't sit right with me, because it is this great moment. It's this moment of, there's a tension that comes before, and then this is the release from that tense moment that happens. And it was important to me to bring it in because it happened to Thelma, and I wanted that to be part of her story again. Mm-hmm. Again, being this character who's a footnote in so many ways, it doesn't sit right with me that her story and this moment of joy had been snatched from her and handed to Wallace. Nah.
Yeah. There's something else too, and I think it's about, it talks to your earlier comments about writing with compassion. Is in that scene we see these three royal brothers living within, some with more, some with less, strictures and rules and boundaries in their lives, that in terms of expectations on them. And here they are, adults, men, well into life, just being boys together, and there's something in a non-destructive way, like sort of the sense of, okay, they're just blowing stuff up and having fun and getting a good laugh. And then the story carries on, and all the epic turns of things that happen, and where they go on into their lives where everything they say or do or every gesture has implication. And the moment of release just seemed to have so much power in that. Yeah, so that I just wanted to tell you about that. I could talk about so many other scenes. I mentioned we had a bit of a correspondence before. There's midway through the book, there's an epic drawn out scene over 2 chapters, and I call it the Christmas chapters, and
Yeah.
it's these ones where everybody in the story is on the page in the space of a very short period of time. And you feel the whole story just start to make its lurch towards, okay, nothing good. I mean, we know most of the endings that are going to happen here, but we say, okay, now we're into the turn. And we won't have time to get into that, but I just wanted to mention that one as well. There's many other little ones here and there, whatever, that jump out at me when I think back on this book, but I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the records, because of course, as a music guy too, anytime somebody smashes records, I'm like, okay, I've done it, but what were they?
No.
So
Actually,
yeah,
the first time I listened to a record, like the full records, was last time I was in Prince Edward County. I stayed at an Airbnb that had a turntable, and I had quite a lot of fun with it. So didn't smash any of the records though.
thank you for that. Well, we're getting towards the end of our time here. I want to thank everybody for tuning in and bringing their questions. Especially want to thank Bryn Turnbull for spending some of your Saturday afternoon with us. And again, the book, I'll try to get this, yes, is The Woman Before Wallace. It's a great read. And just want, is there anything else? Is there anything else you want to talk about the book that we haven't really gotten into today?
Me?
Yeah. Is there anything we haven't touched on?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I mean, you've done an amazing job of teasing out, all these different aspects of the book. So thank you, and thanks to everybody who's asked questions in the chat. I really appreciate it. I mean, one of the things that I said at the top of the hour, and I'll say it again, is this book is important to me because it's a royal romance, but it's not the love story of Thelma and Edward. I mean, we know that, everybody knows going into this book that Thelma's not going to end up with the prince. But the love story for me is that bond between sisters. And that was so important to me. I've got a sister myself. The book's actually dedicated to my sister. And that bond between sisters, that unbreakable link, I think was just so remarkable. And I mean, it's remarkable in Thelma's life, certainly. And yeah, I was really drawn to the sisterhood of this book.
Thank you. Thank you, Bryn. Well, we're going to sign off then. And again, thank you for your time. We'll look forward to The Last Grand Duchess, next book coming from Bryn Turnbull. And if you haven't yet read The Woman Before Wallace, these books are available for you. Books and Company has them. Lots of places have them. So take care. It's a pleasure meeting you. And best of luck both with promotion of this book and with the next one as well.
Well, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure chatting with you.